Hey there, I'm Brandon. This is the Dirt Church Devotional. Let me ask you this. How many times have you prayed and been disappointed because God didn't answer your prayer? Or maybe more likely, God didn't answer your prayer the way you wanted him to. I think it's really possible, too, that maybe we missed the blessing of God's answer to our prayer because we don't recognize it. And we don't recognize it because we don't like it. Let me explain where I'm going with this. There's a guy in the Old Testament. His story starts in the book of Exodus. His name is Moses. Now, he had an incredible birth. He was born at a time when Israel was enslaved to Egypt, and there had been a decree that all the baby boys should be killed. All the baby Israelite boys should be killed. They'd be thrown into the river so they could be eaten by crocodiles, drowned, whatever. And Moses' parents had Moses at this time, and they said, man, we're not afraid of the king. We're more afraid of God. We're not going to kill our baby. So they took care of him for about 3 months, and then his mom put him in a basket that she covered with pitch and floated him down the river, and he was found by the king or Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him in and raised him as her own. Now, here's the interesting thing. The Israelites had been crying out to God for some 400 years. They had been enslaved to Egypt. Ever since Joseph had died. Joseph was one of Jacob, one of Israel's 12 sons, and he had become the number 2 man in Egypt. And anyway, ever since he died, Egypt had forgotten about how Joseph and the people of Israel had blessed him, and they enslaved Israel. And so the Israelites had been crying out to God for deliverance. When Moses is 40 years old, so he grows up in the palace, he grows up learning all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and we don't know exactly how or when God spoke to him, but in Acts chapter 7, it tells us that when Moses was 40 years old, he went out to check on things, and he saw an Egyptian slave master beating a Hebrew. And so he took matters into his own hands, and he killed the Egyptian. And it says this. It says Moses thought that his own people would recognize God was using him to deliver them. But they didn't. Subsequently, the people rejected him, and he ran away, ran out in the desert for 40 years, and finally came back at 80 years old. Here's the thing. Why did the people not recognize that God was using Moses? Why did they not realize that Moses was God's answer to their prayer? Maybe you can hear my cat in the background, by the way, if you hear it. Cat had 2 sets of kittens this year. We got her locked up so she doesn't have any more until we can get her fixed. Anyway, back to the point. I think there's a lot of reasons maybe the people didn't recognize Moses. Maybe one, they just considered him that spoiled kid that grew up in the lap of luxury and never had to work a day in his life. There's no way that he could relate to their needs. Maybe the older generation was a little bit bitter about him because they had thrown out their kids. They had allowed their sons to be murdered, but he survived. Maybe the younger generation didn't like him because he was just out of touch. They just figured he was one of the elites. It doesn't really matter. They missed the point. It cost them 40 years. But what about Moses? He stepped out before it was his time. He took matters into his own hands, and it cost him 40 years. So I want you to think about this. What have you been praying for, and it seems like there hasn't been an answer? Is it possible that God has sent an answer to you? You just missed it because you didn't like it or the person that God had sent, the answer that he had sent. You might want to reevaluate and go back. It could be God's trying to teach you something. He wants to bless you. And on the flip side of the equation, think about this. Some of you are the answer to that prayer. You are the one that God is sending. But have you missed it because you didn't want to go there, or you didn't feel adequate, or you didn't feel smart enough, or whatever? Reevaluate. Stop and think. God wants to bless his people. God answers prayer. Every prayer, God answers. Look around and see if he hasn't been answering your prayer. Look around and see if maybe you're the answer to that prayer. Look around and see if you need to humble yourself and submit yourself to God's plan, his way. Chew on that. Talk to you next time.